Chapter I. City, Two Worlds. Rome was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary cities the ancient world ever produced. At its imperial peak, during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, it held somewhere between 1 and 2 million inhabitants. A concentration of humanity that would not be matched in the Western world for well over 1,000 years after its fall. It was a city of towering marble temples and gilded statues, of aqueducts carrying fresh water from the mountains, of public baths and amphitheaters and forums that dazzled every visitor who set eyes on them. It was also a city of desperate poverty, of narrow streets choked with filth and noise, of people who lived in wooden tenement buildings, some so unstable and so prone to fire that sleeping in them was a genuine act of faith. These two Romes existed in the same space, breathing the same air, sometimes literally within a few steps of each other. The senator in his marble townhouse and the freedman in his rented room 3 floors above a bakery occupied the same city, drank from the same aqueducts, watched the same games in the Colosseum, though never from the same seats. Roman society was not merely stratified. It was organized around an elaborate hierarchy of legal status, wealth, and social connection that governed every aspect of daily life. From the food on the table to the toga on one's back to the manner in which one was addressed in the street. To understand Rome, it is necessary to understand both of these worlds simultaneously. The world of the senatorial class, with its vast country estates, and its town palaces, its elaborate dinner parties, and its political intrigues. And the world of the urban poor, with its relentless insecurity, its dependence on public grain distributions, and the unpredictable generosity of patrons, its remarkable resilience, and its occasional explosive fury. Neither world complete sense without the other. They were bound together by the same economic system, the same political structures, and the same cultural values. Values that both the richest and the poorest Roman would have recognized as defining what it meant to live in the greatest city, Earth. Chapter 2. The hierarchy of status, plebs and slaves. Roman society was divided into legal categories that were not merely descriptive, but actively consequential for every aspect of daily life. At the apex of the Roman social hierarchy stood the senatorial order. Roughly 600 families who sat in the Senate and whose members had served, or were descended from those who had served in the highest offices of the Roman state. Membership in the senatorial order required a minimum property qualification of 1 million sesterces, an enormous sum in a city where a laborer might earn 3 or 4 sesterces a day. And the senators who actually participated actively in Roman political life tended to be considerably wealthier than this minimum. Below the senatorial order stood the knights. The knights, a larger group of wealthy Romans whose property qualification was set at 400,000 sesterces. The equestrians filled the administrative and commercial roles that senators were, by tradition, excluded from performing. They ran the provincial tax collection systems, commanded auxiliary military units, managed emperor's personal finances, and staffed the expanding imperial bureaucracy. Many equestrians were fabulously wealthy. Their fortunes bond commerce, banking, and the management of imperial properties that senators affected to despise. Below these privileged orders came the vast majority of the Roman population. The plebeians, the freeborn citizens of Rome who possessed legal rights, but no formal rank or privilege beyond citizenship itself. Among the plebeians, wealth varied enormously. From prosperous craftsmen and merchants who owned comfortable homes and employed several slaves, to the genuinely destitute who survived on the grain dole and whatever casual labor they could find. Citizenship, cherished status. Even a very poor Roman citizen would have been acutely aware of the distance between himself and those below him on the social scale. At the bottom of the legal hierarchy stood the slaves, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands in the city alone, and who formed a critical component of the Roman economy at every level. Slavery in Rome was not racially defined. Slaves came from every corner of the empire and beyond, captured in wars, born, sold by impoverished parents, or to servitude by the courts. A slave's daily experience depended entirely on the occupation assigned and the character of the owner. A slave managing a wealthy household, keeping accounts, tutoring children, or practicing a skilled craft lived a life enormously different from the experience of someone working in the underground grain mills or than the notorious silver mines, where conditions were so brutal that few survived more than a few years. Between slavery and free citizenship lay the intermediates, and freedwomen, former slaves who had been formally manumitted by their owners. Freed slaves acquired Roman citizenship upon numission, but carried a permanent stigma in the form of their freeds, which was hereditary in the sense that their children would bear the social marks of servile origin, even if they were freeborn. Despite this stigma, some freedmen achieved remarkable wealth and social prominence, and the imperial court itself employed numerous freedmen in positions of considerable power, a fact that caused persistent resentment among the old Roman aristocracy. Chapter 3. In a wealthy Roman home, the great private houses of wealthy Romans. The domus were architectural statements of power and cultural sophistication, designed to communicate their owner's status to everyone who crossed the threshold. The layout of the Roman domus was deeply intentional, and understanding it requires abandoning modern assumptions about the separation of public and private life. A wealthy Roman's home was simultaneously a residence, a business office, a place of worship, and a political venue, and its design reflected all of these functions simultaneously. The visitor approaching a grand domus on one of Rome's better residential streets would enter first the fosses, the narrow entrance corridor, and emerge into the atrium, the central reception hall that was the social heart of the house. The atrium was open to the sky through a rectangular aperture in the roof. The compluvium, which allowed light to fall on the decorative pulo. The impluvium, that caught rainwater. This combination of sky, water, and carefully arranged decoration was not merely aesthetic. It was a controlled environment designed to impress and to signal the household's connection to the ancient traditions of Roman domestic life. Beyond the atrium lay the tablinum, the master's study and reception room, where the paterfamilias would conduct his morning business of receiving clients and managing affairs. The tablinum was deliberately positioned the visual axis of the house, that a visitor standing in the atrium would look directly through it to the garden beyond, perceiving the full depth of the property and its owner's wealth in a single glance. In the grandest domus, this axial view terminated in a peristyle garden of considerable size, surrounded by colonnaded walkways and planted with fruit trees, flowering plants, and the kind of elaborate topiary that wealthy Romans found fashionable. The dining room, the triclinium, was the stage for one of the most important social institutions in Roman aristocratic life. A Roman triclinium was arranged around 3 large dining couches, each capable of accommodating three reclining guests. The host occupied the place of honor on the central couch, and the positioning of guests within the room was a precise social communication. Where you were seated told everyone present exactly where you stood in the host's estimation. The decoration of elite triclinia is typically the most expensive in the house, with walls covered in fine mosaic or painted plaster and floors laid with elaborate geometric or figural mosaic designs that could themselves cost enormous sums. The decoration of wealthy Roman houses reveals an astonishing level of artistic investment and cultural ambition. The paintings that covered the walls of elite rooms, the mythological scenes, the architectural vistas that seem to open the room onto imaginary colonnaded gardens, the still life arrangements of fruit and game, were the work of highly trained painters working from established compositional traditions. The mosaics, particularly those from the great Campanian cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved forever by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, show a range of subjects from the philosophically ambitious to cheerfully obscene that gives a remarkably intimate picture of Roman visual culture at every chapter. Javi. The insula. Life in a Roman tenement. While the wealthy senator relaxed in his marbled atrium, the great majority of Rome's population was living in a very different kind of building. The insula, or apartment block. The word insula means Iceland in Latin, and the name was apt. These multi-story buildings, ages and entire city blocks, their ground floors lined with shops and taverns, their upper stories crammed with rental rooms of every size and quality. The insulae of ancient Rome were the dominant form of urban housing for the city's non-elite population, and the conditions they provided ranged from the merely Spartan to the genuinely dangerous. The ground floor of a typical insula was the most desirable and most expensive rental space. The rooms at street level were larger, had direct access to the exterior, and not subject to the structural instabilities characterized the upper floors. Wealthier plebeians, prosperous craftsmen rented these ground apartments, which might include several connected rooms of reasonable size, and even a small private latrine in the most expensive cases. The ground floor was also where shops and taverns were typically located, and their owners or operators often lived in mezzanine rooms directly above their businesses. As one climbed the stairs of an insula, the quality of accommodation declined sharply, while physical risks increased. The upper floors were where the poorest tenants lived, in single rooms or small groups of rooms that might house an entire family plus lodgers, in conditions of extreme crowding that modern standard would find barely comprehensible. There was no running water above the ground floor. Water had to be carried up from the street fountains in heavy jugs, and waste had to be carried down again, or simply disposed of by throwing it from the window into the street below. A spoken law eventually required pedestrians to shout a warning before dumping chamber from upper windows. Fire was constant nightmare of insula life. Roman buildings of wood and brick, heated by portable braziers filled with glowing charcoal, lit by oil lamps whose flames could easily catch drapery or wooden furniture, were extraordinarily vulnerable to fire. The historian Livy estimated that Rome burned whole or in part dozens of times over the centuries of the Republic. And the Great Fire of 64 CE destroyed large portions of the city. The poet Juvenal in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE described with bitter irony the ease with which a fire could leap from one insula to the next, and the impossibility of escape from a burning upper floor. The structural quality of insulae was a persistent scandal in Roman public life. Building regulations existed, and emperors periodically decreed maximum heights for residential buildings. Augustus limited them to 70 feet, and later regulations reduced this further. But enforcement was inconsistent, and the profit motive of landlords was relentless. Collapses were frequent enough to be a standard subject of complaint in Roman literature, and the satirist Juvenal listed the daily hazards of the Roman street with specificity that suggests personal familiarity: falling roof tiles, collapsing facades, and the wreckage of carts overturning on the narrow roads. Chapter V. Food and the Roman table. Feasting and surviving. Nothing more clearly illustrated the distance between Rome's wealthy and than the food they ate. For the senatorial, dining was one of primary arenas of cultural competition and social performance, an activity governed by elaborate conventions and supported by agricultural estates, urban markets, and trade networks spanning the entire Mediterranean world. For the urban poor, food was a daily struggle. Obtaining enough to eat, of sufficient quality to sustain health, was a central preoccupation that shaped the entire structure of their daily lives. The Roman elite dinner party, the cena. The cena was a theatrical event of considerable complexity. A formal dinner might begin in the early afternoon and extend well into the evening, progressing through multiple courses that demonstrated knowledge, connections. The appetizer might include eggs, fish, olives, and small savory preparations. The main courses that followed could include an extraordinary range of proteins. Roasted dormice glazed with honey and poppy seeds. Flamingong, tong peacock, wild boar. Fish of every kind prepared with elaborate sauces. And the indispensable garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the universal condiment of Roman cuisine, used in quantities that would astonish a modern palate. The great Roman cookbook attributed a writer named Apicius, compiled in a form that survives only antiquity, gives a remarkable picture of elite Roman cooking. Its recipes call for ingredients from across the empire and beyond, pepper and other spices from India, laser from North Africa, from the eastern Mediterranean, and the finest olive oil from the groves of Baetica in southern Spain. The sophistication of the combinations, the awareness of texture and temperature, and the balance of sweet, sour, and savory flavors suggests a culinary culture of considerable refinement. one in which cooking was understood as art form worthy of serious investment. The diet of the Roman poor was a different matter entirely. The foundation of plebeian nutrition was grain, distributed free of charge to adult male Roman citizens by the time of the second BCE onward. The grain dole, the annona, eventually reached a distribution of approximately 5 modi of grain per month per recipient, roughly enough to provide the caloric needs of one adult. Recipients ground and baked their own bread, or to have it done, and the bread that resulted was the central element of a diet that also included legumes, olives and olive oil, cheap wine heavily diluted with water, and occasional small quantities of salted fish or preserved meat. The thermopolium, the Roman equivalent of a street stand, was where the urban poor met their need for cooked food. Thermopolia were ubiquitous in Roman cities. The city of Pompeii alone, frozen in time by Vesuvius, as is Yildiz, more than 80 of them. A thermopolium typically featured a feature on a roof of masonry, with large terracotta containers embedded in it, kept warm by charcoal fires below, holding cooked stews, soups, and preparations that customers could purchase for immediate consumption. Many Romans who had no kitchen facilities in their insulae depended entirely on thermopolia and street vendors for their daily hot food. The Roman street was full of the smells and sounds of this food trade. Vendors of sausages, of fried cakes, of roasted chestnuts and chickpeas. A commercial food culture of extraordinary vitality that served a population unable to cook for itself. Chapter Fee. Water, baths, and hygiene. Shared and divided. Water, one of the most visible expressions of Roman imperial ambition, and one of the most differentials between rich and poor in the city of Rome. The Roman aqueduct system was an engineering achievement of staggering scale. By the 4th century CE, 11 major aqueducts delivered approximately 1 million cubic meters of water to the city every day. Enough to give every inhabitant a daily allocation that would be considered generous by the standards of many modern cities. Yet this water was distributed according to a hierarchy that reflected the social order with remarkable precision. The wealthiest Romans' private connections to the aqueduct system, pipes that delivered fresh water directly into their homes and gardens. This was an expensive privilege. Both the initial connection and the ongoing water fee required resources unavailable to the vast majority of the population. The large ornamental fountains and fish ponds that graced the gardens of elite domus, the private bathing facilities that some of Guest houses were made possible by these direct connections. Fresh running water in one's home was, in Roman terms, one of the clearest possible markers of high status, the great public baths, the thermae, were among the most extraordinary public institutions of the Roman world, and they served the crucial social function of providing bathing facilities to population could not afford private alternatives. By the 4th century CCE, Rome had 11 great imperial thermae, including the enormous complexes built by Caracalla and Diocletian, as well as hundreds of smaller neighborhood bathhouses. Admission fees were kept deliberately low, sometimes as little as a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, and children were often admitted free. Emperors periodically declared free bathing days as a form of popular generosity. The great thermae were far more than mere bathing facilities. They were community centers of extraordinary ambition, combining cold, warm, and hot bathing rooms with exercise halls, libraries, lecture spaces, gardens, and snack bars. The baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 CE, could accommodate an estimated 1,600 bathers simultaneously, and covered a total area of more than 25 hectares. The decorative program of such establishments, marble floors, mosaic ceilings, colossal statues of gods and athletes, was deliberately magnificent, a statement that the pleasures of luxury were available to all citizens regardless of their private means, despite the apparent democratic quality of the public baths. Social distinction persisted within them. Men and women bathed in different facilities or at different times of day. The quality of the oil used for anointing, the quality of the personal attendants who assisted wealthy visitors, the quality of the towels and vessels brought from home. All of these private additions to the bathing ritual marked the wealthy visitor in the thermae as clearly as his toga distinguished him. A wealthy man arriving at the baths with a retinue of slaves carrying his equipment occupied a different social space from the laborer who arrived alone with a second-hand scraper and a scrap of cheap linen, even if they theoretically soaked in the same water. Chapter 7. The Morning Ritual. Salutatio and the Petrotruncleon system. No institution more clearly revealed the structure of Roman social power. Salutatio, facuntio, that the formal greeties is and powerful Romans each day at dawn, understanding the salutatio means binding the entire system of patronage and clientage, and that organized Roman social life, from the highest senator to the humblest freedman, a system so pervasive and so fundamental that it touched virtually every aspect of daily existence. The Roman patron-client relationships at its core, an exchange of resources between unequal parties. The patron, the wealthier, more powerful provided his clients with a range of benefits: legals, assistance in the law courts, business referrals, help in finding employment, gifts of food or money, intercession with powerful officials, and the social prestige that association with a great name conferred. The client, in return, provided his patron with political support, public visibility, the enhancement of prestige through the size and quality of his entourage, and services of various kinds according to his abilities. The morning salutatio was the daily ritual enactment of this relationship. From before dawn, clients gathered outside the doorways of their patrons' houses, waiting in the street for the doors opened. The order in which clients were admitted was itself a social communication. The most important clients were received first in the tablinum or the most formal reception rooms. Lesser clients might wait for an hour or more before being admitted to a briefer and more functionary greeting. The least important might receive nothing more than a spoken acknowledgement from a slave at the door. For the wealthy patron managing his salutatio while also appropriate recognition to clients of varying ranks was a complex social performance that required considerable skill. Clients who attended the salutatio regularly received the sportula, originally a basket of food, later converted in many households to cash payment of 6¼ sesterces. This daily payment was modest, barely enough to buy a simple meal. But for clients at the lower end, the economic scale, it represented a meaningful supplement to their income. The great poet Martial, whose surviving epigrams give one of the most vivid pictures of social life in late 1st century Rome, describes the indignities of the sportula system with a mixture of sardonic humor and genuine bitterness that suggests personal familiarity with standing in cold streets at dawn for a few seconds. The patron-client system extended upward through the entire social hierarchy. A senator of moderate wealth, who received his own clients every morning, was himself of the client of a wealthier or more politically powerful senator, who was in turn connected to the emperor's household. At every level of Roman society, individuals were simultaneously patrons to those below and clients to those above, bound into a network of reciprocal obligation that constituted the invisible infrastructure of Roman public life. When this system functioned well, it provided a degree of social mobility and economic security to people at every level. When it failed, when a patron died without a successor, when political change disrupted established networks, when the imperial economy contracted, the consequences for dependent clients could be devastating. Chapter 30. Work and commerce. Making a living in Rome, the Roman economy was far more complex and commercially sophisticated than older historical accounts acknowledged, while the aristocratic ideal of a Roman gentleman, one of dignified leisure, supported by income from agricultural estates. Commerce was technically beneath the dignity of a senator. The actual economic life of the city was a vibrant mixture of manufacturing, retail trade, financial services, and skilled craftsmanship. Then hundreds of thousands of people, and generated wealth that flowed through every level of hierarchy. The Roman labor market was organized primarily around small workshops. The ergasteria, or officinae, where craftsmen produced goods for sale directly to consumers or to wholesalers. A typical Roman workshop: small street front space with a back room or a mezzanine for storage, and sometimes for the craftsmen's living quarters. The range of crafts represented in Roman commercial was extraordinary. Potters, fullers, dyers, weavers, shoemakers, carpenters, metalworkers, jewelers, glassblowers, mosaic makers, painters, sculptors, and dozens of other specialized trades filled the floors of the insulae and the workshop streets of the city. The legal prohibition on senators engaging in trade or commerce created a peculiar situation in which wealthy men with enormous resources conducted their commercial activities through agents, typically trusted freedmen, who managed their principals' investments at arm's length. This arrangement was an open secret of economic life. A senator might own a brick factory, a warehouse operation, a fleet of merchant ships, and a substantial money lending portfolio, all nominally managed by his freedmen agents. The profits flowed back to the senator, while the legal and social stigma of commerce attached to the freedmen. Day labor was the economic reality for a significant portion of Rome's poor. The Roman labor market included a large casual sector of unskilled who gathered each morning in designated locations, particularly near the Forum, looking for work, construction projects, loading and unloading at the river docks, porterage, and agricultural labor on the market gardens outside the city walls, all absorbed unskilled labor. A successful day worker might earn 3 or 4 sesterces for a full day's labor, enough to buy grain and simple food, but not enough to accumulate any meaningful savings or to weather illness, injury, or periods of slack work. The ports of the Tiber River, particularly great warehousing complex at Ostia, and the river docks at the foot of the Aventine Hill in Rome itself, were among the busiest working environments in the ancient world. Grain ships from Egypt and North Africa, wine and oil, marble from the quarries of Quera and Greece, luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean, all arrived at Ostia to be transferred to smaller river boats for the final leg of their journey upstream to Rome. The dock workers, warehousemen, and porters who handled this enormous commercial traffic formed a significant element of Rome's working population, organized into guilds that provided some measure of collective identity and mutual support. Chapter 11: Clothing and Appearance. Wearing your status. In ancient Rome, clothing was not merely personal choice. It was public declaration of social status enforced by law, custom, and the unrelenting social pressure of a hierarchical society in which everyone was expected to dress according to their rank. The visual codes of Roman dress were sophisticated and immediately legible to anyone who had grown up in the city, communicating information about the wearer's legal status, wealth, political position, and cultural pretensions in a single glance. The toga was the defining garment of the Roman male citizen, and the definition of who could wear it was precise. Only freeborn male citizens had the legal right to wear the toga in public. And this garment, a semicircular piece of woolen cloth, rough, roughly or 6 meters in length, was the uniform of Roman citizenship. The standard toga was of undyed natural white wool, but the variations in color and marked out specific roles and ranks with absolute clarity. Candidates for public office wore the congeda, treated with chalk, produce a brilliant white, which is the origin of the word candidate. Senators and magistrates wore the toga with a broad purple stripe. The clavis, the toga picta, entirely purple and embroidered with gold, was reserved for the emperor and for generals celebrating a triumph. For all its symbolic importance, the toga was notoriously impractical. It was hot in summer, impossible to keep clean on the streets of Rome, difficult to put on without assistance, and required constant adjustment to prevent from slipping. Wealthy Romans had body slaves whose sole duty was to arrange their master's toga correctly, and maintaining its precise folds while walking, sitting, or speaking was a skill that required practice. For these reasons, the toga was increasingly reserved for the imperial period progressed, replaced for everyday wear by simpler garments. The tunica, a simple sleeves shirt, and various cloaks and wraps appropriate to the season. The clothing of poor Romans was a much simpler affair. A basic woolen tunica was the universal garment of the laboring population, worn short for ease of movement, and made of undyed or coarsely dyed wool of whatever quality could be afforded. Leather sandals were the standard footwear for those who could obtain them. Many of the very poor went barefoot or wore simple wooden sandals. The visual contrast between the well-dressed descendant from his litter in a freshly laundered toga and daily laborer in a patched and faded tunica was immediate and unmistakable. Jubla was another arena in which Roman social distinctions were encoded in visible form. The right to wear a gold ring was technically restricted to the equestrian or and above, a regulation that was always honored more in theory than in practice. The imperial period progressed. Since prosperous freedmen, successful merchants, frequently wore gold rings regardless. The elaborate jewelry preserved in museum collections from Pompeii and other Roman sites. Gold earrings set with emeralds and pearls, gold bracelets of twisted wire, and figured design, necklaces combining gold with colored glass and semi-precious stones, represents the taste of the prosperous rather than the super-rich. The jewelry commissioned by the truly wealthy senator const with several orders of magnitude more elaborate and more expensive. Chapter X: Entertainment. Bread, circuses, and the theater of power. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, was coined by the satirist Juvenal as a contemptuous contempt of what Roman rulers had reduced their subjects to caring about: free grain and free entertainment. The phrase is often quoted as a critique of passive Roman mass culture, but it deserves a nuanced reading. The great public entertainments of Rome were not merely distractions. They were complex social institutions that expressed power, reinforced social hierarchies, distributed wealth, and provided genuine pleasure to populations whose daily lives contained relatively little of it. The Circus Maximus, the great chariot venue in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine Hills, was the largest entertainment structure in the ancient world. At its peak capacity, it accommodated between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators, a number that represented a significant fraction of the entire population of Rome. Chariot racing was organized around 4 teams identified by their racing colors: the blues, greens, reds, and whites, whose passionate partisan followings cut across social boundaries in a manner unusual in Roman public life. A senator and a slave might share the same fervent support for the greens, united by the excitement of race, in a way that the ordinary social order would never have permitted. The Colosseum, formerly the Flavian Amphitheater, dedicated in 80 CE, was the venue for gladiatorial combat. The spectacles that most powerfully represented the Roman capacity for organized violence as public theater. Gladiatorial combat had evolved from Etruscan funerary ritual into a fully professionalized entertainment industry, and the gladiators themselves occupied a contradictory position in Roman culture. Legally among them the most degraded members of society, infames, the disgraced, yet yet enormously popular, their images celebrated in art, their names scratched admiringly on the walls of Pompeii, and their sexual appeal to Roman women persistent theme of comic literature. The seating arrangements of public spectacles were themselves a precise map of the Roman social order. In the Colosseum, the closest seats to the arena, the podium, were reserved for senators, magistrates, and members of the imperial family. Equestrians occupied the next tier. The broader citizen population filled the upper sections, with the upward galleries reserved for women and the very poor. Foreign visitors, slaves, and people in mourning were assigned areas in the highest tiers. Attending a spectacle in the Colosseum was, among other things, a three-dimensional experience of the social hierarchy, with one's assigned place communicating one's rank as clearly as the toga did in the street. The theater was somewhat more complex social space. Roman theatrical performances ranged from the high literary drama Plautus, Terence, and Seneca to the broadly comic performances that were enormously popular with all social levels. Seating in the theater was organized along the same hierarchical principles as the amphitheater. The content of theatrical performances, however, could be provocatively egalitarian. Mime, farce frequently prehuned the pretensions of the wealthy and poked fun at social conditions in ways that Roman aristocrats found sounds simultaneously entertaining and alarming. The theatrical space was one of the few in Roman public life where a degree of social transgression actively cultivated. Chapter: Marriage, Family and Children, Love and Calculation. Marriage in ancient Rome was governed simultaneously by law, custom, social calculation, and, for those fortunate enough, by genuine affection. The institution was understood differently at different social levels, and the experience of family life for a senator's daughter was so remote from that of a slave woman or a poor freedwoman that it seems almost to belong to a different civilization. Though both existed within the same system, among the Roman elite, marriage was fundamentally political economic alliance between families rather than a personal choice between individuals. A Roman girl of good family might be betrothed as young 10 or 11 and married between the ages of 12 and 14, the minimum legal age for female marriage. Her husband was typically considerably older, often in his late 20s or early 30s, enough to have established himself in a career, or to have inherited the family property that made him a suitable match. The negotiations that preceded an elite marriage focused on property settlements, dowry arrangements, and the enhancement of family connections, and the prospective bride's personal preference were rarely the primary consideration. Roman law recognized two main forms of marriage: marriage with wife under the legal authority of her husband, assimilating her position to that of a daughter in his household; marriage sine manu, without this formal transfer of authority, became increasingly common in the late Republic and imperial periods, leaving the wife under the continuing legal authority of her father rather than her husband. The practical consequences of this distinction were significant. A wife in a sine manu marriage retained control of her own property and divorce her husband as readily as he could divorce her, simply by stating her intention before witnesses. This relative freedom of elite Roman women compared to their Greek counterparts is a persistent subject of comment by ancient authors. For poor Romans, the legal formalities of marriage were often beyond reach, and couples lived together in informal unions that Roman law recognized in various ways, depending on circumstances. The children of such unions might be legitimate or illegitimate, depending on the status of the parents. With the working class communities of Rome's neighborhoods, the distinction between formal marriage and long-term cohabitation was probably less socially significant than it was among the what poor Roman families shared with wealthy ones was the centrality of the household as an economic and the importance of children as a source of labor, future social support, and continuity of the family identity. The mortality rate for Roman children was appalling by modern standards. Ancient sources and the skeletal evidence from Roman cemetery sites suggest somewhere between a quarter and a third of children died before their first birthday, and that perhaps half died before reaching adulthood. This reality shaped the emotional relationship between parents and children in complex ways. Some ancient authors suggest the high mortality rate discouraged strong emotional investment in very young children. But the evidence of tomb inscriptions tells a different story. The grief expressed by Roman parents for children who died young is immediate, personal, and profoundly recognizable across the centuries that separate us from them. Chapter 2. Religion and the Gods. Public piety and private belief. Roman religion was not a system of, but a complex and capacious institution that combined a state cult, private household practice, imported mystery religions, and a vast landscape of local deities and popular superstitions. The relationship between religion and social class in Rome was everything else, marked by the characteristic Roman tendency to encode hierarchy in every determinant of public life. while simultaneously allowing private belief to operate with considerable freedom. The official state religion centered on the great Olympian deities, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, Mercury, Mercury, and their divine colleagues, whose temples dominated the public spaces of the city, and whose favor was solicited through sacrifice, and prayer on behalf of the Roman state. Participation in state religious ritual was a civic duty, as much as a personal act of piety. The great public sacrifices performed by magists and priests were theatrical events of considerable grandeur, involving the slaughter of expensive animals, bulls, sheep, whose meat was distributed to those present after the gods had received their portion. For the poor who attended these events, the distribution of sacrificial meat was a welcome addition to their diet. The household gods, the lares and penates, were the most intimate level of Roman religious life, present in every home, regardless of social status. Every Roman household maintained a lararium, a shrine, usually located near the kitchen or in the atrium, where most activities were displayed, and received daily offerings of food, incense, and wine. The daily ritual of tending the lararium was typically performed by the paterfamilias, or, in his absence, by his wife, and it represented the most direct expression of the Roman conviction that the divine and human worlds were in constant, intimate contact. The mystery religions that spread through Rome during the imperial period, the cults of Isis from Egypt, Thuras from the eastern provinces, Cybele from Anatolia, and eventually Christianity from Judea, offered something that the official state religion did not: personal transformation, direct experience of the divine, and the promise of a blessed afterlife. These religions cut across social boundaries in ways that could striking. The cult of Mithras, for example, was particularly popular among soldiers and freedmen. Cult of Isis attracted women and the socially alongst the lead adherents. Christianity, famously, initially among slaves, free people, and the urban poor, before acquiring elite converts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Magic and superstition permeated Roman life at every social level, though the forms they took and the resources devoted to them varied enormously. With wealth, amulets against the evil eye were worn by Romans from senators' children to the children of slaves, and the phallic amulet, the fascinum, one of the most ubiquitous protective symbols in the Roman world. Cursed tablets, sheets of lead inscribed with maledictions against enemies, and deposited in wells, springs, or the graves of the untimely dead, have found in numbers across the Roman world. Their content ranging from commercial disputes to romantic disappointments. The diversity of names and concerns represented suggests this form of magical practice was widely distributed across the social spectrum. Chapter Batae, Medicine and Death. Who lived and who died. Life expectancy in ancient Rome was shockingly low by modern standards. And the gap between the health outcomes of the wealthy and the poor was enormous. Scholars working with ancient skeletal evidence, funerary inscriptions, and the limited ancient medical literature have estimated that average life expectancy at birth in the Roman Empire was somewhere between 25 and 35 years. A figure so different from our own experience that it requires careful interpretation. This average was dragged down primarily by extremely high infant and child mortality. Those who survived to adulthood had considerably better prospects. Though the concept of old age, as most people today understand, it would have been a relatively unusual experience. The health environment of the city of Rome was profoundly hostile to its poorer inhabitants. The crowded insulae, with their poor ventilation and lack of sanitation, were incubators of respiratory disease, tuberculosis, duodenal illnesses that spread rapidly through populations. Without access to clean water or effective waste disposal, the Tiber River, into which much of the city's sewage ultimately flowed, was a source of contamination that the aqueduct system could mitigate but not eliminate. Malaria, endemic in the low-lying areas around Rome, was a persistent killer that disproportionately affected the poor, who lacked the means to summer in the healthier climate of the hills. Wealthy Romans had access to private physicians, typically freedmen or slaves trained in the Greek medical tradition that dominated Roman medicine, who could provide a range of treatments, including surgery, pharmacological preparations, and the kind of dietetic advice that was central to ancient thinking. The Greek physician Galen, who served as personal physician the Emperor Marcus Aurelius Aelius in the 2nd CE, left an enormous body of medical writing that documents the of ancient elite medicine and its significant limitations. For wealthy patients, a diagnosis of fevus or infection might lead to a fully managed regimen diet, rest, preparation. For a poor laborer with the saver, the practical options were limited to whatever an urban neighborhood healer could provide at minimal cost. The Roman state provided some limited medical services, military physicians for soldiers, some public physicians in the larger. There was nothing comparable to a public health system in the modern sense. The urban poor relied primarily on a mixture of folk medicine, healing, religious temples and other healing deities. and the remedies of the herbalists and drug sellers who plied their trade in the markets. The island in the Tiber River that was sacred to Asclepius, the god of medicine, as a kind of ancient hospital where the sick could sleep in hope of divine healing. Those too ill to be treated by conventional means were sometimes deposited there by owners or masters who had no other recourse. Death in ancient Rome was a public event in a way that modern Western cultures would find startling. The body of a East Roman, rich or poor, was typically displayed at home before the funeral, which ideally took place within a few days of death. Elite funerals were elaborate theatrical productions in which professional mourners wailed and tore their hair. Actors wore wax masks representing the deceased's famous ancestors. And a funeral procession moved through the streets to the accompaniment of music. The funerals of emperors were spectacles of extraordinary grandeur. The funeral of a poor Roman was a simpler affair, often organized by the burial clubs, collegia, to which many working Romans contributed regular small sums, precisely to ensure they would receive a decent burial rather than the common pit that awaited the genuinely destitute. Chapter 5. Education. Learning by rank. Education in ancient Rome was neither universal nor publicly funded in any systematic way, and access was determined primarily by wealth, social status, and ambitions of individual families. The consequence was a Roman world in which literacy and advanced education were distributed very unevenly across the population, concentrated among the elite and their slaves, accessible to a portion of the artisan and merchant class, and largely absent among the urban and rural poor. The education of a wealthy Roman boy followed a fairly standardized pattern. The earliest years of education took place at home, where a pedagogus, a literate slave tasked with the child's moral supervision and initial instruction, taught the basics of reading and writing in Latin, and the most affluent families in Greek. Greek was the second language of the Roman educated class for full participation in the intellectual culture of the empire, and the ability to read Greek literature in the original, to hold a philosophical conversation in Greek, and Homer was a mark of genuine cultural attainment. From the age of approximately 7, children of the elite attended the school of a grammaticus, a specialist teacher who provided systematic instruction in Latin and Greek literature, the interpretation of canonical texts, the rudiments of rhetoric, and a range of associated subjects including history, mythology, and music. A boy who excelled at this stage might proceed to the school of a reader, a teacher of advanced rhetoric and oratory, whose instruction was essentially a preparation for a career in law or public life. The ability to speak persuasively, to argue in the law courts or for the Senate, the competence to compose compelling or polished speech. These were the fundamental skills that higher education was designed to produce. The education of girls from wealthy families was a more variable matter. There was no formal institutional path for female education comparable to that available to boys. But evidence suggests that many elite girls received a substantial informal education at home, learning to read and write in Latin and Greek, studying music and dance, and acquiring the cultural literacy that was expected of a woman who would one day manage a large household and participate in the Rome's elite. Some women went considerably further. The letters of Cicero, other sources mention women of the late Republic and early imperial periods who were active participants in intellectual and literary life, composed poetry, and engaged with philosophical questions. For the children of the poor, formal education was largely inaccessible. Some literacy filtered down into the artisan class through apprenticeship. A craftsman who needed to read contracts, keep simple accounts, or understand written specifications might teach his apprentices sufficient literacy for these practical purposes. The existence of graffiti in Pompeii and other Roman cities, much of it composed of remarkably complex sentences, literary quotations, and even original verse, suggests that functional literacy was more widespread than it might otherwise appear. But systematic education, exposure to literature, and training in rhetoric remained the preserve of the privileged, and the social and economic advantages these skills conferred were substantial. Chapter Kegsif. The country estate and the rural poor. The economic foundation of Roman aristocratic wealth was not the city, but the countryside, the great agricultural estates, the latifundia that spread across the fertile plains, Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and of the Western Empire were the primary source of income for the senatorial families who dominated Roman political life, while senators and wealthy equestrians maintained their town houses in Rome, cultivated their urban social networks. The agricultural profits sustained this lifestyle were generated on estates by slave overseers and worked by a combination of slave labor and free tenant farmers. The Roman villa rustica, the working farmhouse at the center of an agricultural estate, was a complex of buildings combining the owner's residence, storage facilities, slave quarters, and the processing installations needed to transform agricultural raw materials into marketable products. Large estates produced grain, wine, olive oil, and animal products on a commercial scale, and the financial management of these operations required considerable administrative sophistication. Marcus Terentius Varro and Columella, whose agricultural treatises survive from the late Republic and 1st century CE respectively, give detailed pictures of how rational estate management was understood to work. The optimal ratio of slave to free labor, the best of livestock, the most efficient processing techniques, and oil production. The slaves worked the great agricultural estates, occupied a very different world from the household slaves of the urban elite. Field slaves on large Roman estates lived in harsh conditions, barracked in dormitories called gastula, standardized rations, and worked under the supervision of a slave overseer, whose authority over them was essentially unlimited. The ancient agricultural writers discuss the management of farm slaves in terms that are unsettlingly similar to the discussions of livestock management. Calculating the optimal working life of a slave laborer against the cost of replacement and the productivity achievable from different levels of supervision. The free rural poor of Italy, the small farmers, farmers, and agricultural laborers who had worked the land of the Italian peninsula for centuries before the rise slave-based Latindia, were among the great casualties of Rome's military success. The influx of slave labor made possible by man conquests drove down the price of free labor in agriculture and made it increasingly difficult for small freeholders to compete with large slave-worked estates. The historian Appian and the politician Tiberius Gracchus, whose attempted land reforms in 133 BCE helped trigger the political crisis of the late Republic. Both described displacement of small Italian farmers by the expanding slave-worked latifundia as one of the central social problems of the age. The contrast between life on a great senatorial country estate and the lives of the tenant farmers and agricultural workers, those who worked the surrounding land, was as stark as the contrast between the senatorial domus and the urban insula. The owner's villa, equipped with comfortable reception rooms, private baths, decorated gardens, and all the amenities of cultured life, sat within sight of simple stone or timber dwellings of the colony. The tenant farmers who worked the estate's land in exchange for a share of the harvest. The villa gardens, ornamental fountains, and fish ponds consumed more fresh water than the entire village water supply of a typical rural community. And the owner's kitchen prepared more varieties of food in a single dinner than a colony family might eat in a month. Chapter C. The street, space, and the urban experience. The streets of ancient Rome were unlike anything in the modern world. Noisier, smellier, more crowded, more dangerous, and in their own way more alive than the sanitized pedestrian zones of contemporary tourism. For the urban poor, who spent the majority of their waking lives in or near the street, their apartments too small and too dark and for comfortable habitation during daylight hours, the street was essentially an extension of the home, the primary arena of social life, commerce, and entertainment. Roman streets were generally narrow, often unpaved or poorly paved, and shared by a chaotic mixture of pedestrians, handcarts, pancarts, pack animals, and the litters of the wealthy carried on the shoulders of slaves. Wheeled vehicles were banned from the streets of Rome during daylight hours by Julius Caesar's Lex Municipaliis. As initiated to daytime congestion, which had the practical effect of concentrating cart traffic in the nocturnal hours. The result, as the satirist Juvenal complained with characteristic exasperation, was that the streets of Rome were deafening at night. The rumble of wheels on stone, the shouting of carters, and the general din of a nocturnal city making sleep for those whose apartments faced the street a near impossibility. The street was where much of Roman commerce happened. Tabernae, the small shop units that occupied the ground floors of insulae, that owned ugly onto the street. The written of the street, their goods and services presented to the passing traffic, without any architectural median between seller and buyer. A Roman street in a commercial district would have been lined with an unbroken of butchers, bakers, potters, cobblers, barbers, food vendors, and tabernae of tradesmen in dozens of other specialties, each identified by a painted sign above the door, and by the sounds and smells of the trade within. The Roman barber shop, the Tunstrina, was a significant institution of street-level social life. Barbers in ancient Rome offered not only cutting and shaving, but also the removal of unwanted red hair by other methods, manicure, and various cosmetic services that the wealthy supplemented with the attentions of their personal slaves at home. More importantly, the barber shop was a place of conversation and information exchange, a social hub where news, gossip, political rumor, and commercial intelligence circulated freely among the customers waiting for service. Seneca the Younger complained about the noise of the barber shop beneath his apartment window. Horace used the barber as a character type for the garrulous gossip. The barber shop was social media of the Roman street. Violence was a real and constant feature of Roman street life, particularly at night. Roman cities had no organized police force in the modern sense. The urban cohorts and the vigils, the night watchmen primarily responsible for fire prevention, had limited law enforcement functions and could not be everywhere. gangs of aristocratic young men on nocturnal excursions, professional robbers who haunted dark, and the general social tensions of a highly unequal urban society combined to make the Roman street a genuinely risky environment. The wealthy traveled in groups, and litter bearers and torch bearers, arch bearers, as both conveyance and protection. The poor, who had to navigate the streets alone at night, did so their own risk. Chapters as set. The foundation beneath everything. Any honest account of Roman society must confront the central role of slave in sustaining it. Roman civilization at every level, from the emperor's palace to the urban workshop, the country estate, was built on the labor of enslaved people. Estimates of the slave population during the late Republic and early Empire range from 1/4 to 1/3 the total. Millions of human beings whose legal status as property rather than persons shaped every aspect of Roman economic, social, and cultural life. The Roman slave trade was an international industry of enormous scale. The main sources of slaves were military conquest. Prisoners of war had been reduced to slavery as a matter of course since the earliest periods of Roman history, and the established slave markets of the Mediterranean world, through which people captured in raids, sold by impoverished families, or born into slavery in various parts of the empire, were channeled toward the buyers with the most purchasing power. The slave market at Delos in the Aegean, active in the late Republic, reportedly capable of processing 10,000 slaves a day at its peak, was the largest in the Mediterranean world, though numerous regional markets operated throughout the empire. The conditions of Roman slavery were extraordinarily diverse, and this diversity was one of its most important characteristics. At one extreme, educated slaves served tutors, librarians, and literary assistants to wealthy Roman households, living in relative comfort, and sometimes developing genuine relationships of influence and even of affection with their owners. The philosopher Epictetus was a slave. Playwright Terence was a freed slave. Skilled craftsmen who were enslaved might manage workshops, interact with clients, and accumulate personal savings in the form of the peculium, property that their owners allowed them to hold and use, though legally it remained the master's. At the other extreme, the conditions of slaves in the mines and large agricultural operations were brutal enough to be described in horrified terms by Roman writers who were themselves part of the slave-owning class. The silver mines at Laurion in Greece, the gold mines of Spain, and the grain mills of Roman cities used slave labor under conditions that ancient sources describe as deliberately lethal. Workers chained to their equipment, denied adequate food and rest, replaced as they died. The rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus between 73 and 71 1 BCE, which at its height involved perhaps 120,000 enslaved people, and required 3 Roman armies to suppress. To suppress stands as the most dramatic expression of the human resistance to distance. To these conditions, the prospect of manumission, formal release from slavery, was a significant element of the social psychology of Roman slavery, and the Roman system of manumission was considerably more formal and more consequential than that of most other ancient slave societies. A freed slave received Roman citizenship. A remarkable legal transformation from Greek slave-owning societies and from the slave societies of the American antebellum South. This formal integration of freed slaves into the civic community, combined with the enormous economic and social energy that many free people brought to their new status, created a distinctive social class whose importance to Roman economic and cultural life can hardly be overstated. Chapter 6. The Emperor's Shadow. How imperial power shaped daily life. The Roman emperor's power touched the daily life of every person in the empire. From the senator who attended court and competed for imperial farmer peasant in Egypt, who paid taxes to an imperial estate and prayed to the emperor's genius as part of the official religious calendar. The imperial system that Augustus established after his victory over Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BCE was not merely a form of government. It was a new social and economic reality, restructured the entire fabric of Roman society in ways that became more deeply embedded with each passing generation. The emperor controlled the distribution of the grain dole and the scheduling of public games, the two great mechanisms of popular management that the phrase bread and circuses encapsulates. The plebs of Rome begs their emperor to provide these benefits, and the withdrawal or reduction of either was politically dangerous. An emperor who managed the grain supply poorly, whether through mismanagement, drought, or the disruption of shipping routes, faced the possibility of grain riots in which the urban crowd's fury could be terrifyingly direct. The historian Tacitus records the spectacle of emperors pelted with bread crusts in the theater, a form of pure pust that was as eloquent as it was potentially imperial patronage reshaped the landscape of Rome itself, and through a daily lives of the city's inhabitants. The great building programs of Augustus, Nero, the Flavian emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, and Septimius Severus transformed Rome from a city of largely brick and timber into the marble city that it had become by the 3rd century. These construction programs employed enormous numbers of workers, architects, engineers, skilled crafts in stone, marble, mosaic, and fresco, and the unskilled laborers who carried materials and did the heavy work of construction. The economic stimulus of imperial building and individual emperors were acutely aware that a major construction project in Rome was simultaneously an architectural legacy, a political statement, and an employment program. The imperial court itself was one of the largest economic entities in the Roman world. The emperor's household, the domus causaris, included thousands of slaves and freed people performing every conceivable function: cooking, guarding, entertaining, administering, accounting, corresponding, and managing the emperor's personal business interests, which were enormous. The freedmen who rose to the highest administrative positions in the imperial household during the Julio-Claudian dynasty, men like Claudius's secretaries Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, wielded influence comparable to modern cabinet ministers, managing the empire's finances, correspondence, and legal affairs on behalf of an emperor who lacked the administrative machinery of a modern state. For the senatorial aristocracy, the imperial system was a double-edged reality. It had ended the bloody chaos of the late Republic and provided the stability under which the empire prospered, but it had also stripped the Senate of the genuine political power it had wielded during the Republic. Senators who adapted successfully to the new reality, who learned to express political ambition through imperial service rather than independent political action, who cultivated the emperor's personal favor, and who avoided the political missteps that could lead to accusation of treason, could still have distinguished careers and accumulate enormous wealth. Those who failed to read the new political landscape correctly, or who attracted the suspicion of a paranoid emperor, could lose their property, their positions, and their lives with terrifying speed. Chapter Gnomes, the Long Shadow. What Roman inequality tells us. The civilization of ancient Rome ended not with a single moment, but through a long process of transformation and dissolution that played out across several centuries, complicated by internal contradictions that had been present from the beginning. The empire that had united the Mediterranean world under a single political authority gradually lost its ability, its frontiers, maintain its administrative coherence, and sustain the economic surpluses had funded its extraordinary urban culture. By the time the last Western Roman emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Ostrogothic leader Odoacer in 476 CE, the imperial system had already hollowing out for generations. Scholars continue to debate the relative importance of the various factors that contributed to this process. Military pressure from external powers, the economic costs of maintaining an extensive frontier, the administrative challenges of governing such a large territory, the disruptions caused by epidemic disease, the demographic consequences of agricultural productivity, and a range of internal political dysfunctions. The inequality that we have traced through this account, the enormous concentration of wealth at the top of Roman society, the precarious and dependent situation of the urban poor, the fundamental contradiction of an economy built on slave labor, was not a peripheral feature of Roman civilization, but a central structural characteristic that shaped its development and its ultimate vulnerability. The material remains of Roman civilization that survive, the ruins of the Forum, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the aqueducts, the vast network of roads, represent the extraordinary productive capacity of a civilization that could mobilize resources and labor on a massive scale. But these monuments were built by a society in which the labor that made them possible was extracted under conditions of extreme coercion, in which they expressed was concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, and in which the majority of the population lived with an insecurity and a physical vulnerability that the grandeur, the public monument, permanently obscured. What Rome achieved was remarkable in ways that continue to shape the world we inhabit. Its legal traditions, filtered through Latin, medieval, and early modern transformations, underlie the legal systems of most of modern Europe and much of the wider world. Its language, Latin, gave birth to the Romance languages, spoken by hundreds of millions of people today, and Profei, the technical vocabulary of science, law, and philosophy, in languages that were never derived from Latin at all. Its architecture, its urban planning, and its engineering set standards that remained influential for more than a millennium after its fall. These achievements were real, and they deserve acknowledgement, but the full picture of Roman civilization requires us to hold both realities simultaneously. The extraordinary and the brutal, the magnificent and the squalid, the senator in his marbled hall, and the slave in the underground grain mill. The senator and the slave were not separate stories. They were the same story. Two of a single soul system whose internal tensions, contradictions, capacities, and capacities for both creation and destruction shaped the world that came after it. Rome was not great despite its inequality, but in a disturbing and important sense, partly because of it, and the question of what that means for how we understand our own civilization's relationship to the inequality that persists within is one that Rome's history makes unavoidable.